Hey everybody, welcome to the Great Hike Podcast with your host, Dana Meise, the resident hiker, interviewer and such. Well, the interviews will be coming another time. This is episode 2. Thanks for tuning in. I just wanted to say that I made a mistake on my last podcast where I had said if you wanted to help out the podcast and the content, that you could do $1 a day. It's actually $1 a month, I think, or you could even go lower if you like. So if you were to go to www.thegreathike.ca and hit subscribe, you can it'll link right over and you can donate as little as $1 if you'd like to help out this content, stuff like that, or whatever you want. It could be a one-time thing, or never. Everything's always going to be free, so don't be shy. You can also just go and go to the bottom of that page and just subscribe your email, and you'll get notifications. And eventually I want to give out prizes and do all kinds of fun stuff like that. So we'll get into that later. Again, if you want to follow the stories, you can just go to Facebook, The Great Hike. It's a Facebook page. You can go to Twitter, The Great Hike, Instagram, the.great.hike, or email me at thegreathikeout@outlook.com. I think you guys are getting the picture here. So yeah, and if you're listening to this, you can always go to the YouTube channel and subscribe and like, and you'll get video footage. One of the things I've done now is I've got it so there's some Google Earth footage, so you can actually kind of see from Google Earth where I've been and what I'm doing. I'm trying to incorporate that a little bit more, and eventually I'll be putting in my own video footage and pictures. Now, part of the problem I've had, especially this episode here, is because of the flood that happened, and I lost a lot of my notes and I lost a lot of my pictures and stuff like that. It's been hard for me to dig up a lot of info, so I'm going to be using Google Earth while I can. So please forgive me on that one. This episode here is going to be about before the hike started. It was quite the adventure anyway, just getting out to the East Coast. Some pretty funny stuff, so I think you'll really enjoy just that part of the story. And then the story after will be my first week or so hiking in Newfoundland, and I'll get in so the point is if I was to go in order, we'd be here for years before I finally got to Tuktoyaktuk. So what I'm going to do is there'll be themes and there'll be stories and stuff and interviews, so I'm going to bounce around the country, but for the first few they'll be in order at least. So I hope you appreciate and enjoy that. So yeah, let's get right into this, shall we? So I got a job at Wilmore Wilderness Park, and I'd already paid off pretty much all my debts, and it was a really good paying job. And for forestry, if you travel and you can get somewhere and stay somewhere for months at a time, that's like a total godsend in a sense. So this chance, I had 5 months with all my bills paid to just save money. And that's when I really realized that the dream could come real, and I was like, I can do this. So I went there and I worked. And the great thing about Wilmore Wilderness Park was it was a helicopter ride every single day. So it was a 20-minute ride to half an hour ride. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see the pictures. And it was a great training platform. And towards the end of the contract, the most beautiful part is we were so far in between sites we had to visit that often the helicopter was too busy to come get us. So we'd have some time to kill, which meant we got to peak a bunch of mountains and stuff like that. So it was really great training. And I was really, plus we had to carry all of our gear and our packs and stuff like that. So while I was there, I had planned the trip, and I told a friend of mine, and I wasn't very good on the computer. I didn't know anything about computers. I didn't even have a Facebook page when I first signed up. In fact, a friend of mine built my first website, thegreathike.com, which I ended up losing by accident. And the reason why we called it The Great Hike was just because that was the only thing left available. So there you go. But so I got a friend of mine to book my ticket, which will come into play in a minute here. So after the contract was over at the end of March, I went over to my hometown of Prince George, where I hung out for a week or so, visiting family, stuff like that, getting ready. It was still kind of a surreal thing for me. And then I think I had to catch the plane at like 6 o'clock in the morning, or had to be there, something like that. So then I flew to Vancouver, where I had a 4 hour layover. And this had been my first time ever in a commercial airplane. So then I flew across the country to Montreal, and I remember getting to Montreal thinking like how not only how far this is across the country, but I remember getting to Montreal and we didn't get off the plane. They just said it was a short time before we got to St. John's. And I was thinking, wow, that's a relatively quick flight. These must be smaller than I thought. So a little while later, we land about 45 minutes later, and it's welcome to your destination. And I'm really confused. So it's 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm exhausted, tired. I'd been up since something like 4:30 in the morning. And so I get off the plane and I'm standing there to realize that my friend I didn't even check my ticket. My friend had actually booked my flight for St. John, New Brunswick, not Newfoundland. So I'm roughly, I don't know, 1,500 kilometers short, including a 5 hour ferry ride. So I didn't know what to do. So I got a cab and I took the cab to a hotel, but every hotel was booked. Now you have to remember one thing. There was no smartphones back then. 1 o'clock in the morning, that's it. And all the phone books were ripped out, so I couldn't even phone anywhere. So I just asked the cabbie. $40 later, he found me the only room available, and I think it was at the Travel Lodge, where it was 140 a night, I think, because, yeah, it was like some expensive room. So the next day I woke up, and so I had to get the room. So the next day I woke up and I was going to take the bus. Now there's no Greyhound there. It's only called Acadia or Acadian. And it was booked solid. So then I asked the next day. No, it was booked too. Now I hadn't even gotten my tent or my sleeping bag because I had planned on packing light and just buying that when I was in St. John's, Newfoundland. So here I was really stuck. So I got my stuff together and I couldn't stay at the hotel anymore because it was just too expensive. And I decided that I was going to hitchhike. So I walk out of the Travel Lodge thinking I'll just walk to the edge of town, no problem, and then catch a ride. Well, I get to this toll bridge and they won't let me cross. And I realize the lady tells me it's about a 10-kilometer round trip to get around it. So I turn around and I'm just defeated. Like I can't even walk across this bridge. And out of nowhere, this fella stops and he's like, hey, what are you doing? So I told him and he's like, I'll give you a ride part way out of town anyway. So we did, and he was actually worked at a fish plant, so it was a horrible, horrible, horrible smell. And luckily for me, soon after he dropped me off, I actually got a ride from an Australian-British couple. I couldn't remember who was who, but they drove me all the way into Halifax. And not only did they drive me into Halifax, but they went way out of their way to drive me all the way to the hostel. And apparently in their youth, they had hitchhiked quite a bit and felt like they owed some type of hitchhiker's debt or something like that. So while I was there, this time I decided I wasn't messing around. So I went to Mech and I got my tent and my sleeping bag because I wasn't going to get caught doing that again. And so then I took off and I managed to get a few rides and ended up in Cape Breton where I met some nice people. And I'll tell that story of these people later. But I just ended up staying with them a few days, just enjoying kind of the holiday in a sense, as it was a little too early to start the hike for what I was looking for. And so I helped out around the farm and stuff like that, tossing some hay bales and things. And then I went off to, then I hitchhiked over to North Sydney, now where the ferry is. Now, when I got there, I was early for the ferry, so I went for lunch. And one of the funniest things was while I was there for lunch, I explained to the owner what I was doing. And he tells me he'd almost been there. He'd almost been to Newfoundland 3 times. And I was like, almost? What are you talking about, almost? And so he explains to me that he's owned the pub for over 20-some years and all the ferry people know him. So twice he decided he got drunk and he was going to go to Newfoundland, and but he got on the ferry, but then they took him off right away because he was too drunk. And he says the third time he made it all the way across to Port aux Basques, but then they wouldn't let him let him off the ferry because he was too drunk. So technically, he's never been to Newfoundland. So once I got to Port aux Basques, first off, that was a rough ferry ride. Like, oh my goodness, the sea just rocked so bad, like nothing I'd ever experienced in my life. And I felt drunk. I felt so hungover by the time I got there the next day. And I remember when I got there, I was just sick as a dog, and I had my backpack on, and this Newfoundlander, and forgive my accent here because I'm going to try the Newfoundland accent. You kind of almost have to, and I know I'll butcher it, but forgive me. So this Newfoundlander, he goes to me, "What are you at?" And this is when I'm waiting for the bus, which was almost packed full already. And I told him what I was doing, and he says to me, "Well, you got to have a strong back and a weak mind for that, don't you?" And we both laughed, and I was like, yeah. At the time, I looked like my mind was probably pretty weak. So anyway, so I got in the bus, and it was a 10.5 hour trip across the province to St. John's, where I abruptly took a cab to the hostel, number 8 Gower Street. And when I got there, I was so excited, despite being so fatigued. I had a shower, got myself cleaned up, and I think it was 11 o'clock at night when I went down to the famous George Street. Now, the famous thing about George Street is you can't have a drink at one bar from one end and make it to the other end of the street. Just can't do it. That's how many bars there are. But I went out, listened to some live music and stuff like that, and really enjoyed myself that night, and then came in. One of the things I really wanted to catch a sunrise in Cape Spear, Newfoundland. And the thing about Newfoundland is the weather was pretty brutal. So while I was waiting on this weather, I'd get up every single day and I'd go for a walk. And when I went, like, I would walk around the block sometimes. And I went up to see Signal Hill, and then I went to see this one spot in Quidividi, it's called, where I heard there was an iceberg. So I went and checked all that out. And the iceberg was my first iceberg ever. In fact, I didn't really know much about it. I guess the icebergs came a little earlier that year. But for me, it was pretty cool. I know it's just a big block of floating ice, but to see it was pretty wild. And there was a lot of other people there to see the exact same thing that purposely booked their holidays to be there. So one of the neatest things is I didn't get a picture of it because it was just too far out. But they have these tugboats that actually lasso the icebergs and tow them away from St. John's Harbor, literally. And I was like, wow, that's incredible. And they call it lassoing because I didn't know this either, that when an iceberg breaks off, a baby berg or whatever, it's actually called calving. So go figure. I had no idea whatsoever. And some of these things weigh like 200,000 plus tons. I mean, I just thought that was absolutely incredible. And to watch it happen in the distance, unfortunately, my camera wasn't really good enough at the time. But maybe stuff. Anyway, one of the things is when I was walking around is I have to tell you, like, it was foggy every single day. And every single day I'd go out and I'd go for a walk and I'd meet this older fella. And he was from, he said he was a bayman. And the difference between baymen and townies is the baymen were the fishermen and the working folk out in the bay, and the townies, as they would call it, the sort of the snobs in a sense. So there was the uneducated hillbillies, and then there was the uppity to-do class, I guess. And we would get chatting every morning. He'd be at this bus stop, and he told me he was going to see his girlfriend in Mount Pearl. And he told me he'd never had a driver's license because he had no point to learn to drive, because he didn't need one to drive the boat. And not only that, he never really wanted to go anywhere. So every day he'd tell me, "Oh, you're still here, are you?" So one day I just said, yeah, I got to wait for the weather. I got to wait for the sunrise in Cape Spear. And he says to me, "Hey, boy, you're waiting for the weathers in St. John's, are you? Well, you live here now, don't you?" And he was almost right. Man, I think I was there almost 10 days waiting on the weather. It was absolutely crazy. But, I mean, again, there was so much to see. When I went up to Signal Hill, this is something you learn about in school, but you don't realize until you're physically there. But they still have the old batteries there because they used to defend the harbor. And there were a few battles. I think the Dutch tried to take it. The French tried to take it. I think the French maybe did take it, and then the English took it back or something like that. Of course, it was a very important part of World War I and II, the harbor. And Signal Hill actually is pretty cool. There's a building there called the Cabot Tower because John Cabot was the one apparently that discovered the place in the first place. And I think it was December 12th, 1901 was the first when they sent the first Morse code signal wireless, and all they sent was the letter S. So if you're thinking of using your cell phone today, thanks St. John's, Newfoundland, and Macaron, who actually was the one that do that. I think he stole that from Tesla. Some people will point out, but whatever. But yeah, it's really, really cool. And I think, yeah, St. John's was originally founded by Jean Cabot in 1494, but it didn't come incorporated till 15 something. So I mean, there's a lot of really rich history there. So I really enjoyed that. And I'll tell you something about the fog there. I thought I experienced fog. I've been to the BC coast, but it's literally like floating raindrops that defy gravity. Like my first time ever going out, I was like, oh, a little foggy. I went around the block, came back and changed into rain gear because that's how wet I was. And I'm not exaggerating. It was thick. And another cool story I remember was when I was in my hostel room, I was in and out, and I kept missing my new roommates. And one guy had the same backpack as I had. So finally, when we met, I come in and I introduced myself and these two fellas, Liam and Adrian. They went there to hike, but the weather, I think, in George Street kind of slowed them down on that plan. But they were like, oh, I said, where are you guys from? And they said, oh, a small town, British Columbia, you won't know it. And I was like, oh, give me a try, I might know. And they said, oh, we're from Prince George, which I thought was pretty damn funny. And like, what are the odds that you end up both there to hike, both from Prince George? Maybe it's a cultural thing. So anyway, to the next episode here, that's kind of how it got started. Like, obviously there was a lot of craziness that happened. I ended up in the wrong city, had to hitchhike. Didn't have a tent and sleeping bag at the time and all that kind of stuff. But then but the next episode is going to be in the very beginning, like from finally catching that sunrise, how I got there, and then the beginning and how I felt. And I'll even go into how my training in the mountains did not prepare me for what I was going to be in for. That's for sure. Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to mix up the episodes quite a bit. But what you guys can do, and I think if you're watching the YouTube video, you can actually see where Cape Spear, Newfoundland is. And there's some cool history there I'll get into a little bit as well. But what you can do is, hey, you can go to YouTube, like, and subscribe. That would be a really big help. I would greatly appreciate that. And once again, thanks for tuning in. I'll get more at ease at telling these stories and stuff. I mean, I have them all in my memory and going through all the pictures and stuff like that. But I am trying to do a little bit of a script here. So I'm working on just getting better at that aspect of it. And if you'd like to follow the stories through all the main channels, like thegreathike.ca, or Facebook page, The Great Hike, Twitter, @The Great Hike, Instagram, the.great.hike, and The Great Hike, outlook.com. If you want to leave a comment or anything, tell me what kind of stories you'd like to hear. If you want to give a shout out to somebody, maybe a fellow hiker or someone who's done something extraordinary or just does day trips and something interesting to share, who you'd like me to interview as far as adventurists. Also, again, if you'd like to donate, you can. It's right there, www.thegreathike.ca. Subscribe. Give me any suggestions. And hey, I'll even do some advertising on here until I get the audience. If I can transfer all my social media audience over, then, that would be a huge benefit to me. But that's not how social media works. So out of the 9,000 people, maybe only 100 or 2 seem to see my posts. So, there's a lot of work to be done. So if anyone wants to advertise, I'm more than open for that. Just send me an email or comment or whatever you want to do. So anyway, thanks again for tuning in. I appreciate that, guys. I hope you enjoyed this bunch of stories I just told. And again, we'll get into it a little bit more. I'm kind of blabbering on right now, but as I can get more and more of my stuff back, and once I get into the flow of the storytelling, I think there'll be a lot you're really going to love. So just tell me what you want. All right. Thanks for tuning in to episode 2. Bye-bye.